Toliver's Secret, Chapter 11. And now there was only a half-mile to go. Mr. Murdoch had said that his house was only a half-mile from Elizabethtown. But how in the world could she ever walk on legs that were shaking like saplings in a windstorm? And how could she ever find her way in the great loneliness of the night? She could hardly see the road at all. It was only the rough hoof marks of horses that had passed by that helped her feet find the way. She stumbled along, choking down the fear that made a lump in her chest. I fought a pig, she kept telling herself, so I can do this too. On either side of the road, the trees stood black against the dark sky. It seemed to her that their branches were arms, moving, groaning, bending low to grab her. She tried to remember the friendly look of the trees in the late afternoon light, but these were more frightening. Each hair seemed to stand up straight on her head, and she put on her cap to hold them down. They're only the trees, and they can't hurt me, she said over and over. And that moaning sound, it's only the wind. With sharp lashes, it whipped angrily around her cold, wet legs. Ellen was all alone, but she was filled with a stubborn will. Nothing was going to stop her now that she was only a half-mile from Mr. Shannon's tavern. Whenever she passed a dark shadow of a farmhouse sitting behind a stone wall, she could smell the smoke from the chimney. There must be people inside. People eating bowls of piping hot stew, sitting inside a crackling fire. Perhaps children were pulling on nightshirts that had been warmed at the fire. Perhaps they were climbing into bed and putting their feet against warm bricks wrapped in wool. Mother had always warmed her bed for her this way at home. Not a crack of light showed at the windows. Although a dog barked at the sound of her feet crunching in the snow, the doors remained shut. And then, far ahead, she saw a light, no bigger than a needle prick in the dark. Maybe it's Mr. Shannon's tavern, she cried and tried to run, but her cold, wet feet would not obey her. She stumbled and slid on the frozen road, and she could not make them hurry. As she slipped from one uneven hoof mark to the next, she found herself saying over and over, I shall run and not faint. I shall walk and not grow weary. Somehow the words made her think of grandfather. She remembered him sitting by the fire in the kitchen with his little reading glasses on his nose and the old Dutch psalm book in his hands. They that wait upon the Lord, she could hear her grandfather's cheerful voice. They shall walk and not be weary. They shall run and not faint. It made her feel better to think of the words that grandfather read aloud and believed so firmly. When at last she came close to the light, she saw that it poured from an open doorway. She knew it was the doorway of a blacksmith shop by the clang of a hammer on an iron anvil. Wearily, she stumbled up to the door and leaned against the doorframe. When she could catch her breath, she would ask the smith the way to the Jolly Fox Tavern. The small barn was filled with dark shadows and flickering lights, for at one side, the fire in the fireplace glowed on a hearth that was almost as high as a table. How good it was to feel the warm air blow over her as she stepped inside. The blacksmith was startled when he looked up from the anvil where he was beating a horseshoe into shape. His blue eyes shone bright in his grimy face. What brings you here, boy? He said sharply. It's a cold night to be out. Oh, sir, I'm frozen into an icicle. Step up to the fire then, but don't alarm the horse. Ellen ran up to the fireplace just as the smith raised a dirty hand and pulled the rope of a huge leather bellows. A burst of air from its small mouth sent a swirl of sparks flying up among the shadows and made the fire flare up in a bright flame. The whole soot-covered room was filled with light. From the rafters overhead hung old iron tools and worn-out bits of harness and broken yokes for oxen. Even the brick fireplace looked old, covered with a coat of sooty cobwebs. With the barn brightened by the fire, Ellen could see at the other side of the room an old gray horse waiting to be shod, and in the corner beside the horse a big man sitting on a barrel. He was wearing a plaid muffler wrapped around his fur hat and tied across his mouth. He saluted her with one mittened hand and held the reins of the horse in the other. He said nothing, but she could feel his sharp eyes look at her closely. Maybe he's the courier, she said to herself. But no, not with that old horse. A courier would have a strong, swift horse who could run for hours. When the smith lifted his long tongs and put the horseshoe into the fire, the hairs on his arms shone like copper and matched the lock of hair that fell over his forehead. Where did you come from? He asked. Oh, Ellen hesitated. She was so cold and miserable she couldn't think of an answer. Never saw you before. Where are you from? From, Ellen groped for some kind of answer, from Mr. Murdoch's farm. You a bound boy there? Asked the man in the fur hat. Ellen jumped and turned to see him pull the muffler down from his mouth. He had tipped his head to one side and was watching her carefully. The blacksmith grunted. I'll wager that wife of his would send a boy out on a night like this. She's a strange woman, Mistress Murdoch. He began beating the curved piece of red-hot iron with his hammer. Will you tell me the way? Ellen began. Suddenly the horse stamped his feet on the wooden floor, and the big man jumped up and patted his nose and rubbed his ears to quiet him. He was the tallest man Ellen had ever seen. As she waited for the man to quiet his horse, she took off her mittens, leaned forward, and held out her cold hands to the fire. She quickly clutched her jacket when she felt the loaf of bread start to slip down. What's that under your coat? The big man spoke up quickly. It's nothing, said Ellen. Must be a sack of gold, he said. Do you think it's a sack of gold, Smithy? Ellen looked to see if he were serious, but she couldn't tell. Nope, said the smith, but I'll wager it's a bag of good English coins. Perhaps he's a paymaster for the redcoats, said the big man. Or a runaway thief. Ellen thought they must be teasing her. She looked from one face to the other. The smith was serious. The other man's eyes were laughing. She hugged the bread close to her chest. It seemed to her the tall man's eyes looked right past the brass buttons of her coat. She was sure he could see the loaf of bread underneath, but she was not going to show it to him. Did you steal something from the redcoats? He asked as he leaned forward and peered at her across the room. Perhaps he wasn't teasing after all. The smith grumbled. Lots of stealing around here. Horses, saddles, blankets. You can't trust anyone these days, not since the British came. Now, bring up the horse, he said to the man with the muffler. Ellen backed into the corner on the far side of the fireplace while the old horse was led to the blacksmith's side and tied to the wall. My horse is too old for any redcoat to steal, said the owner. He patted the horse's nose while the smith lifted a hind leg and steadied it on the leather apron that covered his knees. With a sharp knife, he began to slice off small bits of the hoof before he attached the iron shoe. Now, said the man in the muffler, what's under your jacket, boy? Nothing, cried Ellen, nothing at all. Must be right valuable, said the man, from the way you were hiding it. It's nothing but a loaf of bread, Ellen called over her shoulder as she dodged around him and darted to the door. She almost choked over the words, she was so tired and upset. Maybe they were only teasing her, but she wasn't sure. She did not know who this tall man was, or why he had been so curious about what was under her jacket, but she had had enough trouble for today. She did not need any more.